Kia good morning everyone, Rich Wong here, welcome back to the channel. Some of you may know I am usually a prime lens shooter, but there is one type of zoom lens that I really love, is the all-in-one zoom lens that has a really big zoom range. While the all-in-one zoom lens image quality is nowhere as good as prime lenses and usually it's not even any better than the kit lens, and it also has quite slow maximum aperture as well. But I have a soft spot for it because all-in-one lens is just very convenient. You just need one lens to cover a wide range of focal length from wide angle to telephoto. I love to use it when I travel, especially when I travel to another country. As I don't have to carry so many lenses, my camera bag is a lot smaller and lighter. But what's even more important is that I don't have to swap my lens after taking a few photos, which is not really ideal when I'm traveling. However, one thing about these all-in-one lenses is, while some of the latest all-in-one lenses are getting smaller, they are still quite a bit bigger than a prime lens or kit lens, and also quite a bit heavier as well. But this may be a thing of the past, because today we are looking at this new Lumix S 28-200 all-in-one lens. It has a 7x zoom range, but this lens is very similar to the size and weight of Lumix's own S20-60 kit lens. This new lens not only covers a much wider focal length range, it also has built-in optical image stabilizer and some other feature that the Lumix S 20-60 kit lens doesn't have. So how does Lumix manage to make this lens so small? And is there lots of compromises for Lumix to create such a compact all-in-one lens? I've been testing this lens over the last few weeks and I will share with you all my results and thoughts in this review. Alright, the first thing I want to talk about is that this lens is just extremely small. The length of this lens is only 93.4mm and the front filter thread is just 67mm. The size of this lens is almost the same as the pre-compact Lumix S 20-60 kit lens. It's only marginally taller, but it's not just about the size, it's also very lightweight. The lens is only 413 grams, so it's only 60 grams heavier than the Lumix S 20-60 kit lens, so it is pretty crazy for a 7x zoom full frame lens. On this channel, I have previously reviewed a few reasonably small all-in-one full frame lenses like the Nikon 24-200, Tamron 28-200 and the Sony 24-240, but this Lumix lens is noticeably smaller and lighter than all of them. This Lumix S 28-200 is the lightest and smallest 7x zoom full frame lens in the market. Since I'm not an engineer from Panasonic, I don't really know exactly how they make this lens so compact, and I'm sure it's not like there's one special trick. Instead, the engineers must have done many things together. But I'm guessing that is the reason why the wide end of this lens is 28mm. The Tamron all-in-one lens that we have reviewed on this channel also starts from 28mm. So there is nothing wrong with that. But the latest full-frame all-in-one lens from Sony, Canon and Nikon, they all start from 24mm focal length, which I think is more flexible. The maximum aperture is f4 at the wide end and f7.1 at the teddy end. It's about 1/3 stop slower than the average all-in-one lenses in the market. While it's not a huge difference, it is probably one of the trade-offs to help make the lens a bit smaller. By the way, I have plotted this graph to show you the maximum aperture of this lens at different focal length. I think some of you may be interested. And if you're wondering how much zoom you can get from this lens, here is an example that shows you what the image will look like when shooting at the wide end 28mm, and then we zoom in all the way at 200mm. There is quite a big difference. But a zoom lens is not just to allow you to zoom into your subject. One of the most powerful feature using a zoom lens is that you can quickly and dramatically change how your photo look even if your main subject remains the same size in the photo. To show you what I mean, here are a set of photos that I shot using this Lumix S 28-200 lens at different focal length from 28mm all the way to 200mm. I keep the position and size of my C3PO figure the same in all the photos. You can see the photo looks very different as I change the focal length. The background changes dramatically. The background blur is also very different, even though all the photos were shot with the same aperture setting. And if this is a portrait photo, you will also see the face of the model will change quite a bit as we change the focal length. But this is not very obvious with my Droid model. But anyway, what I want to show you is that a high power zoom lens is not just about able to zoom in, it just gives you a lot more control in terms of how your photo will look like. The body of this lens is mostly made of plastic, just like most of the Lumix S lenses. It helps minimize the weight of the lens, but the lens still feels pretty decent in terms of build quality, and it has a metal lens mount. The lens is also dust resistant, splash resistant, and also freeze resistant down to -10°C or 14°F. The lens optical construction is 17 elements in 13 groups, including one aspherical lens, 4 ED, and 1 UHR element. It may sound like a lot of elements, but the number of elements is not uncommon for an all-in-one lens. The front element also has fluorine coating to help it minimize the chance of oil or dirt stick on the front element, which is really useful as this lens has very good close-up shooting capability, so there's more chance your front element may accidentally touch something when you are shooting close-up photos. I'll talk more about this lens close-up shooting capability very soon. Just like their recently released 100mm macro lens, the text printed at the front of the lens is printed in gray color instead of white. The reason is that when you are taking close-up photos, especially if your subject is refractive, then you won't have the reflection of the white text visible in the photo. There is a AF/MF switch on the lens, as well as a switch for you to enable or disable the image stabilization. Yes, the lens has built-in optical image stabilizer, and let's talk about that next. Even though this Lumix S 28-200 is a very compact lens, but it still has the built-in optical image stabilizer, and I was a bit surprised by that. If you are shooting with a Panasonic camera that has the IBIS, they would work together as dual IS2. According to Panasonic, the dual IS2 can give you up to 6.5 stop image stabilization at 200mm focal length based on the Zeapon standard. But to me, Zeapon rating is really just a guideline, and that number is usually quite different from the real-world performance in my experience. So I did some tests to see how effective the image stabilization is when shooting photos. I shot a few hundred photos with this lens mounted on the Lumix S5 II. I was standing and hand-holding the camera with nothing to support me at all. I shot the photos at different shutter speed, different focal length, with and without image stabilization enabled. Then I checked the photos and count how many of these photos are sharp at each of the settings. At 28mm focal length, my test results shows the image stabilization provides about 3 stops improvement. I could handhold the camera and shoot photo at half-second shutter speed, and most of the photos would still turn out to be sharp. At 200mm focal length, enabling the image stabilization would give me about 4 stops improvement. I could shoot at 1/6 shutter speed, and most of the photos are still sharp. My test results don't really match the official 6.5 stops Zeapon rating, but I have never ever managed to match the Zeapon rating, no matter what camera brand I'm testing. I don't really understand those Zeapon rating to be honest, but no matter what, 4 stops of image stabilization at 200mm focal length is pretty impressive, and I think is one of the best ever result I got from any full frame camera that I've tested so far. Autofocus performance of this lens is pretty decent when I'm shooting during the day, especially on a bright sunny day. The autofocus operation is also very quiet. However, due to the maximum aperture is only f4 to f7.1, the autofocus performance would drop quite a bit when shooting in a dark environment, especially when you're shooting at the telephoto end. This is one of the usual trade-off when shooting with an all-in-one lens because the maximum aperture is quite slow. We'll now look at the image sharpness, and let's start with the wide-end 28mm focal length first. And let's compare it with the Lumix S 20-60 and also the Lumix S 14-28 lenses, as these are the wide-angle compact variable aperture lenses from Lumix. I want to see this new all-in-one 7x zoom lens image sharpness is better or worse than those two lenses that covers a much smaller zoom range. At f4, the 28-200 lens is already really sharp at the center, contrast is good, and I can also see the false color and moire pattern in my test photo because the image is really sharp. Compared it with the Lumix S 20-60, the two lenses are pretty much the same. Both are really good. At f5.6, now we can include the Lumix S 14-28 as its maximum aperture is f5.6 at 28mm. The three lenses' center sharpness are all excellent. There really isn't much difference between them. When I load these photos side by side on my computer and load it up on a big screen, I can see the Lumix S 14-28 is slightly not as sharp as the other two lenses at f5.6, but the difference is really small, so I'm not sure if you can see the difference once I upload this video to YouTube. As usual, once we reach f11, then diffraction starting to make the image softer. The Lumix S 28-200 is the only lens that you can stop beyond f22, so you can stop down all the way to f32 at 28mm focal length, which is quite useful for a few things that I'll talk about a little bit later on. But at the same time, you can see the image does become noticeably softer at f32 when you compare it to photo I shot at f4. So it is a trade-off that you need to consider when you are considering what aperture setting that you should use. Now let's look at the corner of the image at 28mm focal length. At f4, the 28-200 lens corner is a bit soft, while the Lumix S 20-60 is also not that great at the corner. It's still a little bit better than the Lumix S 28-200. Stopping down to f5.6, it noticeably improved the Lumix S 28-200 lens, but I think the 20-60 lens is still slightly better, and now we can compare with the 14-28 lens, which appears to be the sharpest out of the three in this comparison photo. When we stop down to f8, the Lumix S 28-200 is now really quite sharp, pretty much the same as the other two lenses. At 28mm focal length, focus at the corner or focus at the center of the photo makes no difference to both the center and corner sharpness. It suggests the lens has very minimal amount of field curvature, at least at 28mm focal length. And let's have a look at the image sharpness at 200mm, and this time we'll compare it with the Lumix S 70-300 and also the Lumix S Pro 70-200 f4 lens. The Lumix S Pro 70-200 f4 lens is the most expensive and also the biggest and heaviest out of these three lenses. At f7.1, which is the Lumix S 28-200's maximum aperture at 200mm focal length, the center sharpness is pretty decent, better than I expected. It is quite similar to the Lumix S 70-300 lens, but not surprisingly, the S Pro 70-200 f4 is noticeably sharper. Stopping down to f8 would improve the sharpness of the 28-200 and also 70-300 lens a bit, but from f11 onwards, all these lenses will become softer and softer as you stop down the lens further. All these three lenses are a bit soft at f22. But with the Lumix S 28-200, you can continue stopping down the lens until f45. And if you do that, the lens is really soft at f45. So unless you have some special reasons why you want to stop down all the way to f45, and there are special reasons why you would want to do that, but other than that, I usually would not recommend you stop down the lens all the way to f45. Let's look at the corner now. At f7.1, the 28-200 lens corner sharpness is reasonably good and quite similar to the 70-300 lens. The S Pro 70-200 f4 lens is once again sharper. Stopping down to f8, it improved the Lumix S 28-200's corner sharpness slightly, and that's the best corner sharpness that you can get from this lens. As you stop down the lens further, diffraction will starting to soften up the image. And once again, focus at the center or the corner of the photo makes no difference to the corner and center image sharpness. So it seems this lens has very flat field curvature, which is a good news. Panasonic says the maximum magnification ratio of this lens is 0.5 times, and that is at 28mm focal length. This semi-macro capability is great as it makes the lens even more versatile. In terms of image sharpness, when shooting at the minimum focus distance at 28mm focal length f4, the image is reasonably good, but you can get better sharpness when you stop down the lens. Even just stopping down to f5.6 will improve the sharpness and contrast noticeably. The minimum focus distance is 14 cm when you are shooting at 28mm focal length. That means there's only 3 cm or just a little bit over 1 inch between the front of the lens and your subject when you're shooting at the minimum focus distance, so there isn't really that much space. If you want to have a bit more space between the lens and your subject, you could shoot at a longer focal length. For example, if you're shooting at 200mm focal length, the distance between the front of the lens and the subject is now about 50 cm or around 20 inches, so you can stay at a much further distance from your subject, which is especially important if you want to take some photos of some live insects or animals. The trade-off is that the maximum magnification ratio will now be a bit lower when you're shooting at a longer focal length. The maximum magnification ratio is around 0.3 times when shooting at 200mm focal length, which is still pretty good. With most lenses in the market, the minimum aperture that you can use is usually f16 or f22. However, with this all-in-one lens, you can stop down to f32 on the wide end and even up to f45 on the teddy end. This is really useful for close-up macro photos as you can get more depth of field, so your subject can become pretty in focus without having to do any focus stacking. Or if you are like me who like to shoot some model cars and want to make the model car looks like a real car, if you shoot at a large aperture, the shallow depth of field would make the photo looks exactly like what it is. It is a miniature setup. So I usually would stop down the lens as much as possible, like shooting at f16 or f22, and the photo would look more like a photo of a real car. But having the ability to stop down even more would just give me a little bit extra depth of field, and that would help me to create the illusion that I'm shooting photo of a real car, not a 1:64 scale diecast. With the maximum aperture is only f4 to f7.1, this is one of the slowest lens for the L mount right now. However, because the maximum focal length of this lens is 200mm, you can still dissolve the background quite easily when shooting at the telephoto end. You can also blur the background when shooting close-up photos thanks to its 0.5 times close-up capability. So in terms of the bokeh or the quality of the dissolved background, I find it is only alright. While the bokeh can be quite smooth and nice in a lot of my photos, I do also see a bit of halo ring around the edges of the bokeh balls in some of my photos. There could also be a bit of cat's eye bokeh, But it only seems to happen when I'm shooting at the telephoto end and the focus distance is very close, like less than 1 meter. So overall, I think the bokeh from this Lumix S 28-200 lens is acceptable, but I don't think anyone is buying an all-in-one lens if they want the most beautiful bokeh anyway. At 28mm focal length, the lens has very minimal amount of vignetting. Even at f4, there is quite minimal light fall off near the edge of the photo, and once I stop down to f5.6, then there is virtually no vignetting. At 200mm focal length is even better. Even at the maximum aperture, I don't really notice any vignetting at all, so that is really good. But these are the photos shot with the lens profile correction applied. Let's see what the photos would look like with the lens profile correction disabled. At 28mm focal length, there is a tiny bit more vignetting at f4, but it's so tiny that if I don't put the photos side by side, we probably won't even notice the difference. And once we stop down to f5.6, then there is no difference at all. At 200mm focal length, disabling the lens profile correction makes virtually no difference in terms of vignetting performance. So in terms of vignetting performance, this lens is probably one of the best lenses that I've ever tested, which is quite surprising considering the very compact size of this lens. We'll have a look at Chromatic Aberration next. Here are some high contrast photos I shot with this lens. This photo was shot at 35mm focal length. Let's zoom in and do some pixel peeping. I think it looks pretty good. I don't see much color fringing. And this photo was shot at 167mm focal length. Also pretty good. And now this photo shot at 200mm. It's also really good. Very minimal amount of chromatic aberration. Now, the next photo is the worst example that I got in terms of chromatic aberration. If we zoom in to the top of the photo, then we can see a bit of purple fringing. But to be honest, the amount is still quite acceptable, and as I said, this is the worst example I got out of the hundreds of photos that I shot with this lens. Looking at my local test photo, there's also very minimal amount of color fringing. Let's have a look at distortion now. Here are a few photos I shot at different focal length. There is only very minimal amount of distortion, nothing really noticeable from the wide end to the tele end. But again, these are photos with the lens profile correction enabled. If I disable the lens profile correction, there is a bit of barrel distortion at 28mm focal length. As I start to zoom in, it will turn into a bit of pincushion distortion, and it will remain like that even when I zoom in all the way to 200mm focal length. Considering this is a 7x zoom lens, I would say even without distortion correction, the amount of distortion is still not bad at all. I've tested a lot of prime lenses that has more distortion than this. I'm always very impressed by the lens flare performance of Lumix lenses, and with this Lumix S 28-200 lens, I do wonder if the fairly complex 17 elements design would negatively impact the lens flare performance. But luckily, it doesn't seem to be the case. The lens flare performance is really good with this 7x zoom lens. Sometimes I do see a little bit of purple lens flare or ghosting, but it's really minimal. Most of the photos and video I shot, I see pretty much no lens flare issues at all. Let's talk about Sunstars, and I have some good news and bad news to share with you guys. Bad news first, when shooting at wide end, you need to stop down the lens to around f16, then you can start to see a little bit of Sunstars. The teddy end, 200mm focal length, I need to stop down even more to f22 to get Sunstars. Now the good news is, as I've mentioned earlier, with this lens you can stop down more than most other lenses in the market. So if you stop down the lens all the way to the minimum aperture, which is f32 on the wide end and f45 on the teddy end, then you can get some really nice and sharp 18-point Sunstars. While the Sunstars are really quite beautiful when you stop down all the way to the minimum aperture, the problem is that with such small aperture, diffraction would soften up the image quite a bit, and your shutter speed may have to be really slow or you have to bump up your ISO a lot. When I was checking some of the sharpness comparison photos, I noticed that the photo shot with the Lumix S 14-28 lens seems to have a little bit different colors to the Lumix S 28-200 lens. But those photos were shot outdoor with natural sunlight only, so any difference in color could be just because of the changes in ambient lighting. So for me to really test and compare the colors, I shot another set of photos, but this time I shot them indoor with my studio lights so I can control the lighting and keep them constant. With this controlled lighting, the colors are very similar between all these four lenses that I'm comparing. I think the Lumix S 14-28 may still be a tiny bit warmer than the three other lenses, but the difference is so small that I don't think it is noticeable at all when you are shooting photos or video in real life. Just like every L-mount lens from Panasonic, this Lumix S 28-200 lens is designed for hybrid shooters, which means it's very suitable for videographers as well as photographers. You have the choice between linear and non-linear manual focus mode as usual. Autofocus is very quiet and smooth. With the S5 II, continuous autofocus also works very well. Focus breathing at the wide angle end is pretty much non-existent. But what really surprised me is that even at the 200mm focal length, the telephoto end, there also appears to be very minimal focus breathing. If you want to shoot video with a gimbal, usually a problem when shooting with a zoom lens is that because the length and the gravity of the lens would change as you change the focal length, it would upset the gimbal's balance. But with this lens, because the lens is quite lightweight and it also doesn't really extend as much as some other similar lenses, so you could get away without having to rebalance the gimbal when you change the focal length. It is even possible to swap to the Lumix S 14-28 lens without having to readjust the gimbal. And if you want to use this lens to shoot some vlogging style video, I found the 28mm focal length at the wide end is a little bit too tight. Here is an example video I shot with this lens at 28mm, with me just hand holding the camera, but pretty much I have to fully extend my arm. It's doable, but the framing is a bit too tight if you ask me. And I really have to fully extend my arm all the time, or the camera would just get a little bit too close to me and my face would fill up the frame, and that would look pretty horrible. Compare it with, say, using the Lumix S 20-60 and shoot at 20mm, I think I much prefer the composition when shooting with the 20mm focal length, as to me the video looks a lot more comfortable. And let's have a look at the video IBIS performance. When shooting at the wide angle end with the S5 II, I know that even just the S5 II's IBIS can already stabilize the video footage very well, so I'm not surprised when I combine it with the 28-200 lens optical image stabilizer. The dual IS result is really good, even when I was just walking normally when shooting this video. This is a video I shot at the telephoto end 200mm focal length, also with the Lumix S5 II. I was standing without anything to support me at all, and it was a pretty windy day as well, so I actually can feel my body was moving a little bit when I was shooting this video, and I think the stabilization works pretty good. The footage is very stable, and if you want it to be even more stable, we can enable the Boost IS feature on the camera. And if you also enable the electronic image stabilization, then it would be even more stable, pretty much like you are just shooting with a monopod. But one thing that you need to be aware of if you want to enable Boost IS is if your camera moves or shakes a little bit too much and outside the range that the stabilization system can handle, then you may see the image will suddenly jump a little bit. This lens appears to be a parfocal lens, which means when you adjust the focal length, the focus point wouldn't change, so it wouldn't drift forward or backward. Before I share my final thoughts about this lens, if you found this video is useful or it has provided you some information that you want to know about this lens, it would be really great if you can click the like button or drop a comment to support my channel. I would also really appreciate if you consider subscribing to my channel, as one of my goals is to reach the 100,000 subscribers one day, and right now it's still very far away. So I've been waiting for this all-in-one lens eagerly since it was added to the roadmap, and I'm really excited this lens has finally arrived, as this is the first full-frame all-in-one lens for the L-mount shooters. In terms of image quality, for an all-in-one lens, I think the lens designer at Lumix did a very decent job. Image sharpness is good enough. Vignetting, distortion, and chromatic aberration control are all excellent. Sunstars are not bad if you are happy to stop down the lens a lot. I do mean a lot though. And it is also very suitable for videographers with the minimal focus briefing and the linear manual-focus control. And I also like its semi-macro close-up capability, and its image stabilization is excellent. But the best thing, of course, is that it's just such a compact and lightweight lens. It's pretty much the same size as the Lumix S 2260 kit lens, but it offers 7 times zoom and also optical image stabilization. And then the image quality is pretty much just as good as the Lumix S 2260. One of the main reasons I really love the Lumix S 2260 is its 20mm wide-end focal length. I find 20mm is a really versatile focal length, very good for landscape and urban city photos, and also great if you want to do some vlogging style video. So to me, I was a little bit disappointed when I found out this all-in-one lens starts from 28mm focal length. I really wish it is a little bit wider. If I can design my all-in-one lens, I would definitely want the wide end start from 20mm focal length, even if that means the tele end has to be a little bit shorter to keep the size of the lens compact. But of course, I'm not an optics engineer, so I have no idea if that actually makes sense or possible. But anyway, this lens starts from 28mm focal length is the only thing that I don't like about this lens, and that is purely based on my personal shooting preference. It doesn't change the fact that it is still a very impressive lens, just like the recent Lumix S 100mm macro lens. This new 28-200 lens redefined what an all-in-one lens could be. An all-in-one lens can be really compact, yet delivers decent image quality. What I would really like to see next from Panasonic would be a nice pancake lens that is reasonably fast, between 30 to 50mm focal length. That is something that I would love to carry around with me every day. And if you are like me who also love to shoot a little bit wider than 28mm, but you still like the idea of the all-in-one lens, you can pair this Lumix S 28-200 lens with the Lumix S 14-28. This would be a lightweight 2-lens combo that covers from 14mm to 200mm. That would give you a 14 times zoom range that you can go super ultra wide, and that would be a great compact travel setup. The other lightweight 2-lens option would be the Lumix S 20-60 combined with the Lumix S 70-300. So which one would be the better option? Well, in terms of image quality, both options would be very similar. There is some minor difference, but it's not like one option is noticeably better than the other one. So instead of image quality, there are a few other things that you should consider. If you choose the 28-200 with the 14-28, The wide angle covers all the way to 14mm, which is much wider than 20mm. 14mm field of view is 114 degrees compared to 20mm, which is 94 degrees. So it's 20 degrees wider. The 28-200 is one lens that covers from wide angle to telephoto. So it's one lens that can handle most of the photos that you need to take, and you only need to swap to the 14-28 when you need to shoot some ultra wide angle video or photos. These two lenses together is only around 750 grams, so it is a very lightweight setup. On the other hand, if you choose the 20-60 plus the 70-300 lens, it is a bit heavier. The combined weight is 1,150 grams. So that's about 400 grams heavier, and there is a noticeable difference in terms of weight and size as well. This setup will give you slightly higher zoom range, so it's 15 times instead of 14 times, which is not a huge difference to be honest. The real difference is that you gain quite a bit of telephoto end, but you do lose a bit of the wide angle end. The other thing to consider is that since these are all variable aperture lenses, the maximum aperture that you can use at different focal length is a little bit different with these two options. I've checked the maximum aperture at different focal length with these four lenses, and here is a graph that shows you the maximum aperture that you can use with each of these options. You can see the maximum aperture value differs a bit, but with the 20-60 plus the 70-300 option, overall the maximum aperture is a bit faster. From 70mm onwards, there is about half a stop advantage in terms of maximum aperture. Half a stop is not really a huge difference, but when you are shooting at the telephoto focal length, it can still make a bit of difference. So if you are deciding between these two options, you really have to ask yourself the question: do you shoot a lot of photos at the longer focal length, like 100mm or longer than that, and the longer the better? If that's the case, the 20-60 plus the 70-300 would be a better choice for you, as it gives you a little bit more reach, and you can shoot at the faster aperture at the telephoto end to keep the ISO half a stop lower. That would be really useful under low light. But if you want to go as wide as possible, or you want one main lens that can cover from wide angle to telephoto, then the 28-200 plus 14-28 would be a really great combo for you. It's also quite a bit smaller and lighter as well. 400 gram difference is really noticeable, especially if you have to carry your camera bag whole day when you are traveling. Now, for myself, we have just booked a family trip to visit Taiwan and Japan later on this year, and I am thinking of taking the S5 II with two lenses, so I also need to decide which combo I should go for. Now, even though I know the things that I need to consider, but it's still not really an easy decision. I don't think I can go wrong with either of these options, and it's good that we are getting more and more options now these days with more and more L-mount lenses. And of course, there are also other L-mount lenses that we can consider as well. But what about you? Do you like this new Lumix all-in-one lens? Are you interested in getting this Lumix S 28-200 lens? What would be your ideal travel setup? I'm interested to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let me know.